Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a whole new episode of Bilateral View. And today we are going to discuss a very interesting concept that we have referred to in a couple of our previous episodes, and that is ontology. This concept was coined by Jacques Derrida in his very important and very interesting book, Specters of Marx, published in 1993. Jacques Derrida was and continues to be a French philosopher. He left us in 2004, but his words, his books, his ideas continue to speak to us, continue to, well, for lack of a better word, haunt us even today. And especially the two of us, as we were discussing Dr. Magan backstage, how much Jacques Derrida is special to the both of us. We will have hopefully some very interesting conversations around that concept, hauntology. But before that, let us revisit Jacques Derrida's context. He was writing throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and until he breathed his last. His first book was Speech and Phenomena, and the second one, Of Grammatology, which was translated by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, uh, created some kind of furor. Jacques Derrida's all-important paper, Structure, Sign, and Play, is believed to have launched the movement called post-structuralism. So he's a very, very complex thinker, and he comes up with portmanteaus every now and then. Uh, so, so Ontology is not apparently very difficult for Jacques Derrida to have coined, but it is very challenging for us to understand. And there are so many kinds of meanings available, and so many kinds of meanings that have been discursivized in architecture, in humanities, and in cinema, in theater, even in the realm of supernatural studies and death studies, that it becomes a bit cloudy and staggering to understand what hauntology really is. I'm guessing, Dr. Magan, that hauntology is certainly not just a synonym of haunting. What do you have to say about hauntology?
Good evening, Professor Chatterjee. We have been waiting for this moment to explain to them what hauntology is. It's not the literal ghost, okay? This is just to give our audience a very quick idea of what this is. We have a compound word here, haunting, and ontology. Hauntology. Derrida specifically guides us to his worldview about some memories in the past. We think that these memories should reside in the past. But what if we tell our audience that memories could not reside in the past anymore because they're so aggressive to infiltrate the future? And this is the core idea of why we long for such things, why these lingering thoughts are always intruding. And each time they intrude, there are questions. And each time there are questions, the whole world goes crazy. Professor Chatterjee, it's beautiful to think that ghosts don't necessarily scare us. But in the concept of Jacques Derrida, we have to be afraid of these very abstract ideas because they're not literal. They are residing in the minds of people, especially in the Cold War era. Okay, we're now talking about the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapse, and there's the idea of Karl Marx. Derrida is there to critique, and he is continuously asking whether or not there is still a Marxian relevance in all this, whether or not capitalism, as we are having up to this day, is really going to be heralded as the best. Because, the way we see it, Derrida is seeing a lot of loopholes. And in these loopholes, we are seeing as well the Specters of Marx, hence, his seminal book in 1993. So, our dear viewers tonight, brace yourselves, strap up, because you'll get to know more about these hauntings that are not so ghostly as you encountered in your lives, in your haunted house, no. but in your haunted mind, in this haunted world, in this world where there are a lot of global phenomena that we have to address. And whether or not these ghosts are that scary to make us create questions at the end of the day, we'll find out.
Well, thank you for that prelude, Dr. Magan. It's very interesting that you plunged into the basic matter of fact, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1989, 1990. Just before the publication of Specters of Marx, we have Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, and that was such a catchphrase, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and so Francis Fukuyama pronounces the end of Hegelian history, as it were. So not to say that history writing itself will end after this, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, no new ideology would be produced. That is to say, after the widespread impact of liberal democracies or capitalist neoliberal policies, which are spreading through vast parts of the earth by the time Derrida writes Specters of Marx. So I'm speaking from India. And in 1990-91, in India, we have something called the liberalization of the Indian economy. And in many other parts of the world, we have the onset of neoliberal traditions, invented traditions, in new molds coming up, new technologies invading our lives, sometimes in a very happy way, and then going on to create a very much of discontentment in family traditions, in older social hierarchies, and so on and so on. And according to you, so you are suggesting that Derrida is perhaps reading the present society in the early to mid 90s as still being pervaded by the ghosts or the specters of Marx. So I would like you to clarify if that is indeed so. And would you have any comments on this end of history kind of a reading of contemporary society by Francis Fukuyama? But most importantly, what I would like to understand from you above everything else is, so when Derrida talks about specters of Marx, both in his title and in his initial parts of the book, he refers to two key stalwarts. One is Karl Marx himself, and the other is Shakespeare, especially Hamlet. Shakespeare's play Hamlet, wherein Hamlet is procrastinating because his father has turned into a ghost, and he comes and goes, and the ghost is neither present nor absent. It's a revenant, an apparition, some of the terms that Derrida uses. But I'm wondering, we in a laymanish understanding of Marxism, we tend to associate Marxism with various kinds of atheism, or any kind of skepticism or disbelief in the extra-human or extraterrestrial powers. So is this correlation actually very neat, or is there a kind of a fissure somewhere? Or Derrida talking about the specters of Marx. Marx who himself apparently talked about religion as the opiate of the masses, but he also went on to say it's the soul of the soulless world. So people don't really ethically cite Marx. They don't cite him in entirety. Nevertheless, as his life would suggest, he was not really a church goer. He wasn't really devoted to a supernatural entity. So can we ethically speak about his specters?
Before that, Professor Chatterjee, you mentioned earlier whether or not there's a need for us to respond to the question on history being dead. Well, that's the very reason why Derrida's Specters of Marx is very prominent, because Derrida himself never believed in the end of history. In fact, he discursivized that it is very active as we speak. There are certain ghosts at present coming from the past that tend to question whether the foundations in the modern period, or even in the 21st century, are actually bulletproof and could no longer be, or could be beyond the questioning of the human mind. So that alone tells us that history can never be dead. In fact, the very presence of specters, okay, the ideological concepts, can very well tell us that, this will continue until the end of time. And, the end of time phrase is not even the end of time phrase, because time is very, very mysterious. It is not a segment as if having 2 points. It continues ad infinitum. So even the question of whether or not people like Marx is even inclined to believing in a supernatural or in a higher being or in a divine entity, that is part of the ad infinitum quest for humanity to, discursivize these very essential foundations of existence. Hence, Derrida wanted to really do the portmanteau of haunting and ontology, because he believes that in our very own being, in our existence, there's that lingering question, the ultimate question, which perhaps, and I would argue, which perhaps Marx himself found out to be very much bothersome. I thought that he had this, he came across the idea of his very own existence. And, even if we argue at some point that probably he could not be in that proclivity to think about God, for instance, because he is very material, his concept of communism is very material, about equality, which is not very much the same. If you look at the biblical reference point, where inequality essentially is the foundational principle, because there's the livestock owner and there's the people who have to maintain the livestock and do other stuff for the master or something like that. Even if we think of it that way, we can still give some leeway for for our own argument to connect it to Marx's proclivity in believing the higher power up there. Well, I would think, Professor Chatterjee, that his quest for these things, having people in a place where there's no inequality, there's no isolation, there's no poverty, and that people can live well, that resonates with how essentially the Bible wants everyone to be in the same position. I mean, God doesn't want anyone to starve. God doesn't want anyone to be treating the poor so bad. In fact, the poor people are so special to him, and God wants the poor people not to be not to be corrupted by those in power. If you treat the poor well, then God is going to be very happy and will reward anyone if he is a Christian, for instance. So if we look at these things in relation to how Marx could probably be in a theocratic proclivity, there's a 50% positivity there. However, Professor Chatterjee, many would say that Marx is a bit tacit about his own belief in whether or not there is a theocratic government, and whether or not, when I say theocratic government, that revelation up there, that there's a higher power. Because he's just very concerned with how the material things should be governed. But towards the end, perhaps, he had it in his mind. And that's why, before he died, he left the world the idea of the specter that continues to haunt us even unto this day. And that even without him, we could continue asking ourselves whether or not there's this entity that is neither alive nor dead that could be overpowering anyone. That between the thing that is the original and the simulacrum itself, because that's very prominent in the discussion of Derrida, the original and the simulacrum. In that distance between them, what exists and what do we see? Is it that which continues to haunt us? Is it that which allows us to continue asking these questions that are very foundational in our existence?
Well, apart from the fact that I've never actually heard anyone, any serious scholar that is, talking about Marx and Bible in the same way. So it is, it's a bit eclectic, whatever you said, but what I've heard is people talking about some kind of a relationship between Adam Smith's invisible hand, which he talks about in The Wealth of Nations, and the invisible hand is not very well defined by Adam Smith. I don't think he uses that notion very frequently in his writing, but it has been defined as, that kind of a invisible entity or force that brings, let's say, a bunch of needles, a bunch of spokes, a bunch of rims of wheels, and creates a machine out of them. So if everybody is happy doing what they are doing, and if the person who's giving the paycheck is generous enough, then the world goes on in a free market capacity. So I think so. I'm not an economist, and that might be a very, very obscenely simple definition of the invisible hand. So please forgive me if people know far, far better than me. And in a similar vein, I think Marx, uh, who's not a votary of the invisible hand, but seems more like a critic, he comes up with the concept of surplus value. And according to Marx, it is the capitalist who keeps the profit in his pocket, and the profit is constituted by the surplus value. So the worker creates the legs, the feet of a table, or the top part of the table, and the sheets that cover it, and the workers paint it. But when these individual parts come together and create the table, which is definitely bigger, which is not encrypted in the feet or the top of the table, but which is a whole new entity, as if a new spirit has been breathed into it. And this surplus value, according to Marx, is evil. So while I don't know if I can agree with that biblical reference that you just smuggled in so seamlessly, I think Marx definitely has certain notions of good and evil, and these are very strong notions. And that is why many critics of Marxism in the 21st century have started calling that a new religion, just like wokes or wokeism, wokeness is identified as a religion without God. So yes, maybe there is some kind of an ecclesiastical and evangelical fervor in Marx's thoughts. But I suppose my next question would be to slightly row back into the text itself. Uh, what can we draw from Specters of Marx, and what can we draw from Hauntology, other than the Marxist concepts of surplus value? Having said that, I mean, would you like to react to Marx's notion of surplus value, alienation in any form and shape? And in addition to that, what do you think Hauntology can do other than refer to Marx and sociology and economics? So are there other disciplines where Hauntology has become a popular currency?
Surplus value sounds very interesting to me. I'd like to really reduce that to a very laymannish term, profit. That's what we think of it. All around the world, all across the globe, people are very familiar with capitalism and how you work for this particular time frame. But then the owners of these companies are getting more, right? So the absolute type of surplus value and the relative type of surplus value. Very simply, as what I experienced here in my country, we have the absolute surplus value. I mean, you're only expected to work for say 8 hours, but then because you're so workaholic, or you're being asked to do some more work, you extend it, but the wage is still the same. And all of us can relate to that. The other side, very relative type of surplus value, the same time frame, but then you're asked to do more within that time frame. So the result, there's higher productivity. Either way, you don't get anything. The profit goes to the owner, okay? And the profit goes to the government as we speak, and the government is earning more. And like you and I, we understand how this works. But despite that, we're happy, right? Because we love what we're doing. And even if we're not told to do things beyond our schedule, then we're just happy to strive more and exert more effort because that's who we are. We love to do researching even beyond office hours, and that's so understandable, right? Because we love what we do. So yes, your question about whether or not there are other disciplines that latch onto the idea of the specter, or that sort of use the specter to elucidate further their causes too. Well, in literature, we can see this. In visual arts, you can see this. But I'd like to go for literature first. Contemporary literature. We have always been given stories that ask very big questions, regarding migrancy. Well, this is very inherent in transnational studies. We are seeing globalization very much discursivized each day, which brings along these ideas about identity crisis or even identity politics and so on. So how does the specter intrude in these disciplines or in this literary excavation or experience? So very clearly, say, Sandra Cisneros' The House on the Mango Tree. Very simply, there's this migrant family moving to the US and they're finding their ways to navigate their lives differently and independently. And towards the end, there's this habit of writing, which this main character found to be very therapeutic. And writing for her was the reason why she was able to understand all these. Without writing, we can say that she wouldn't be able to find who she is because the ghost of her past continues to haunt her. These ideas, whether or not she should be staying in the new place or going back, or would she be able to navigate her life in the new place, given that America is a highly multiracial place? Should she be just content with living her life in Mexico, and would that make a huge difference? Or is living in the US justifying the greener pasture platform for her? All these things are considered for migrants. And going back to the MAGA campaign, Make America Great Again, politically, we're saying the ghost is at the middle of this whole MAGA conversation, right? The very important word in that campaign is again. So this implies that there was a past situation of America, which really frames our mind that in the past it was all right. It was wonderful. It was booming, productive. And now the present administration wants to renew that sense of spirit to defend the country, sort of revitalize the American spirit. Who coaches these present administrators to look back? Marx has one response: the ghost of history. Derrida responded to that by saying, it is the specter of Marx that reminds the American people that there's the need to revive that spirit. Or if you're not American, again, the ghost telling you, come on, analyze it properly, because if you think that capitalism is the way to go, then why are you still very poor? Why are you still not having the very huge assets in the bank? Why are we only having a select few? These are quintessential situations where one is led to believing that perhaps there's a problem. Well, in visual arts, for instance, I thought that everybody's familiar with how these paintings are sort of no longer the realistic type. We're not seeing a real human being on the canvas. We're seeing abstract ideas, the mashup of colors, as if you're asked by the painter to step back. Once you're at the gallery, just step back, don't look closely, because if you look closely, you won't see it. Step back and try to find out the bigger picture. If there's something lurking behind those pictures or those colors on the canvas, wonderful if you see it, but it's more challenging if you don't see it, because you really have to see it before you even go out the gallery. That is a major challenge instigated by the specter. The specter wants people to really become very critical in everything that they do. So once again, Professor Chatterjee, the specter is not just applicable in the whole economics field. It's very much present in every discipline there is.
Very interesting. I think somewhere down the line we might also want to talk about Slavoj Žižek and his articulation of of surplus value in what he calls surplus enjoyment, actually, borrowing from Jacques Lacan. But uh, that that's a tale for another day.
Mm.
What I am reminded of in your optimistic description of the past, considering the MAGA campaign's keyword again, um, there's this very well researched by now uh, symptom in in the political lives of South Asian democracies and indeed several other democracies, whichever democracy has taken a nationalistic, a hyper nationalistic turn in the last 20 or 30 years. I think it's applicable to a post Soviet universe in general, and that is of ontological insecurity. And you mentioned that it's the ghost that is not letting us enjoy the present moment. And that is indeed what Derrida also, I think, is trying to formulate in relation to ontology, that it is a kind of an entity that is neither present nor absent. But ontological insecurity refers to a past, to an invented tradition, which actually was never there in the first place, or you do not have any evidence, any lived experience of having seen that not again, whose replica you're trying to build in the again. So the past that your again is referring to could very well be a fiction, and that is leading to a state of ontological insecurity in many people, whether it is in the Israel-Palestine conflict or Ukraine-Russia conflict or any other kind of ethnic conflicts that we have witnessed in the South Asian and Southeast Asian parts, and also certain conflicts of regarding maritime borders, which I think the Malaya archipelago is more exposed to in the last 2 decades or so. So I don't know how you would react to that, because it seemed to me as if you were taking these ghosts to be a very optimistic or optimism causing entity, and you were taking the or were you presuming, was I wrong in thinking that you were sort of presuming the past to be indeed glorific, which needs to be recreated and transplanted onto the future? So how would you
Well,
react to
yes
ontological?
and
Yeah.
no, Professor Chatterjee. A glorific past and non-glorific past, you can either say both can be applied because, well, we understand that there are a lot of past events that cannot be brought back at the present scene because they're just too harsh, sad, and gruesome. Talk about the World War II scenario. No one wants to talk about that anymore, but if you go to Israel, you'd find every Jew very much sensitized to what happened to them in the past, so that they used their past to understand the present. More so, they want to build on that past event for them to have better relations with, say, Germany. And in fact, Germany now is very much in that position as well, of using the past events with the Jewish people to make a better relationship with them, not just with them, but with the rest of the world. So that's a very gruesome past that turns things into more beautiful scenes that one wants to relish. But yes, you're right in the observation that I'm kind of seeing these ghosts as helpful, as efficient, because even Derrida would call them the specters of justice, right? So there's an implication there that in every era there's a miscarriage, a wrong conduct, a flawless situation, which could be analyzed properly if we look back and use the ghost of the past to, in a way, explain whether or not these things happening at present are going to make sense of how we are going to move forward. Now, what's very interesting is that these ghosts don't just intrude the present; they intrude the future too. We have
Mhm.
the abortive future and the nostalgic. Yeah, this is a very clear notion coming from Derrida, the nostalgic specters. and the specters for aborted futures. So you're seeing a very fluid line through which these ghosts operate: past, present, future, future, past, present. It seems that there's no toll fee whatsoever because they can just go freely, walk to and fro,
Mhm.
back and forth, and make sense of what's happening in the past, in the present, and more importantly, in the future. So, Professor Chatterjee, if you think that these specters can very much factor in the progress of society, as we want progress all the time, I mean, the answer is yes. There's no doubt about that. Because in every past event, there will always be lessons learned. And whether they're good or bad, people can always learn from them. And more importantly, that these past events, these specters, are reference points that do not sugarcoat things. Well, you said
Mhm.
it yourself that they are not glorific at some point. They are glorific at some point. Either way, these ghosts do not ever masquerade themselves as something else. They don't know how to sugarcoat. They are straightforward beings. They're neither dead nor alive, but are very much true about who they are. And this is the irony of it all. They're not
Mhm.
saying, okay, I'm present. They're not saying, hey, I'm absent. They're just simply there. And you don't even call that absent nor present, which is very weird, but very interesting, right? That's why we're so fixated on this one. And more importantly, because they're not in either side, they can very well assert their agency as specters, and that in their own right of being a specter, they have their own unique agency of infiltrating our minds, even governments, so that at the end of the day, there is a very well informed understanding of what we are now and how can we progress basing on those things that happened in the past.
That's very interesting. So when we spoke about Harari, you will know Harari's book Nexus in our second episode. I was reminded of Jacques Derrida several times while reading that text. I think Harari refers quite charitably to Michel Foucault, somebody who is more or less nowadays, cancelled in the academia for whatever reason, right or wrong. Um, and my next question would be on those lines. So he does not refer to Jacques Derrida for reasons best known to you will know Harari. He's a incredibly intelligent person, and I don't think he would have much difficulty understanding Jacques Derrida and taking him to newer newer pastures. But my question to you would be, based on a certain context that I inhabit. Now, when I read or when I used to read Jacques Derrida with a great deal of passion, by the way, I made a great deal of use of the concept of ontology in my own doctoral dissertation, which I wrote about Masuri. As I mentioned to you, Dr. Magan, and our viewers would also know by now, the Agatha Christie episode. So I'm not an architect, but I studied a great deal of architectural theory, including by Bernard Schumi and other contemporary architects and thinkers. And Derrida was in many literary theory textbooks listed as an architectural thinker, which is very interesting. Anyhow, long story short, so the context that I come from, it's a very complex and very rich history of philosophy. The most major religious philosophies and secular philosophies have emerged from this. To name one person, Nagarjuna, who's one of the founding parents of modern day Buddhist philosophy, is a second to third century or maybe slightly earlier Buddhist thinker. And there were many other mystical thinkers from the Hindu tradition and Buddhist tradition whose philosophies are more, let's say, in tune with Taoism and Confucianism and so on. Now, this strand of Eastern mysticism, a lot of people have argued, has had a lot of impact on Jacques Derrida, and research after research has shown that. So people take this as an interesting example of multicultural fruition. But when it comes to Derrida's language itself, if somebody does not refer to all these possible borrowings that Derrida might have been undertaking, I think the Western academia has been heavily critical of Derrida's language. I'm guessing the people who found so much objectionable in his language, intellectually speaking, people would generally say that he was more of a wordplay kind of a guy. He was not rigorous enough. But I think they were not exposed to the kinds of philosophies that I tried to contextualize Derrida in. Having said that, you as a reader of Jacques Derrida, I mean, what's been your experience? What would you tell your students? Post-structuralism is not a hot topic anymore in the academia. Today, people find it problematic to go through long sentences, multisyllabic words, sesquipedalian words, portmanteaus, and so on. But what has been your experience? Now, you have a different epistemology, you have a different political context, and you are also, as much as maybe I am, also a neutral reader apart from being an ideological mind. So what would you tell university students of the 21st century who are so afraid of Jacques Derrida and the post-structuralists?
Yes and no to that. People are scared when they see Derrida on the pages, but some of my students aren't. But yes, I go for the majority first, who are a bit scared in approaching him. Perhaps the reason is, you're right, the concatenation of so many brilliant ideas on those pages, and that we can very well say that he is the guy who can articulate his ideas so well. And in doing so, structures have to be clear, exact, and it's as if these structures are so special that you can't have any other structure but these structures in these texts. That's why the specter itself in the book Specters of Marx is a clear example of a structure that cannot be replaced by any other. I mean, there's a ghost, but what is the difference between the specter and the ghost? If I were to latch onto the Cebuano Visayan phonology, matagak versus mahagbong, they mean the same. The gravity is pulling everything downwards, but the main difference is the impact of matagak is not as huge as the sound that mahagbong creates. So imagine just holding a pair of scissors right
So,
here.
what are these two words or concepts, if you would like to elaborate?
Okay, Cebuano Visayan matagak. Imagine a pair of scissors, watts, falling on the floor. It doesn't really create that scary sound, but on the other side, mahagbong, the same idea, falling to the ground. There's the object, say, one sack of rice from the seventh floor down to the first floor. Boom, you imagine everything is just so destroyed on the ground. You really have to imagine that the sack is bursting open. So the kind of sound created is just so scary for mahagbong, but not much scary for matagak. Similarly, ghost, specter. Ghost, not so scary. I mean, perhaps because of the sound g, the consonant sound, and towards the end you have the dispersing sound. So, the structure itself doesn't create that compelling, energy for one to be really drawn to it. Versus the word specter, at the middle, there's that medial sound that sort of asks you to think and stop because you're about to be overwhelmed, something like that. At the beginning, you're made to go easy with us, but then second sound say p, there's a stoppage there. More importantly, with a k, another stop, and the r, it's like the roaring sound of the tiger. Roar, the theatricality there, Professor Chatterjee. The performative interpretation, the interpretation that performs its own idea, that changes its own interpretation. It's kind of interesting, something that I came across while reading The Specter of Marx. So Derrida, okay, here's the recommendation. We shouldn't be scared about, Derrida's structures. But if in case people are still scared of these structures, well, we can't blame them because, again, these words are so powerful. These words are specters themselves. They inhabit our sensibilities. And in fact, on a daily basis, we're made to choose between one word and another. We are made to believe that one word is more powerful than the other. Why do you think, let's go back to MAGA, why do you think Trump is using the MAGA where G is at the middle? I mean, there's an impact. There's a psychological impact that the phonology is given to, the people who want to listen to this MAGA campaign. We have ideas of, okay, Marx, compelling us to listen to him because essentially his name is so critically interesting. Marx, there's again the k at the middle. You see, it's a pattern we're seeing, the stop at the middle of the word. It's just telling us to simply pause for a while and discursivize whether there's something like a great deal in this particular word. Otherwise, we can just shun and forget that. But there's no way for us to forget about Derrida structures. Apart from the lexicography, it's semantics. Okay, they grow each time. It's pragmatics. Even when the semiotic part is very rich, all the more the pragmatic side to it. I could recall, he mentioned how this idea on feminism is, very much associated with the body itself. Like the body is, okay, the corpore is where the whole discursivization of what a female is being confined to. So that when you think of women's fight for something like the fight for equality, one cannot detach that from her own corpore, which is until now a specter among people who go for feminism, both radical and liberal. That's the reason why we are seeing Derrida in ethics, in linguistics, and in many disciplines, because his idea cannot be abandoned because they're so powerful. And this is the beauty if you know your forte, your expertise, your purview, because you cannot be wrong in attacking these things that need to be intruded, just like the specter needs to intrude in the political realm. Because again, for Derrida, there has to be that need to intrude.
Derrida is also somebody, Dr. Magan, who very interestingly goes entirely against logocentrism. His entire life, his entire philosophy was dedicated to a battle against logocentrism. Now, I don't know how mainstream Christians would feel about that, and I'm guessing if a lot of the West, which has turned atheistic, or at least in public life, deeply atheistic, or secular, maybe the better wording. So I'm not sure if there's a correlation between the West that dislikes Jacques Derrida, the Western academia that dislikes Jacques Derrida because of his battle against their logocentric propensities. So I think that's a question that we'll have to explore only with time, because that's a huge question, and I don't expect you to answer that already, because at Bilateral View, our questions and indeed our responses are always very responsible. We are the boring, studious type of people, who read Jacques Derrida and Specters of Marx and who actually enjoy it. So because you were telling me how much you enjoyed rereading the Specters of Marx backstage, and I really very much hope that you are able to instill that spirit of the specters, the Geist, the spirit of the age, to take from Hegel, and that I am able to instill that spirit in my students here in India. So the challenges are very, very huge, but I think we'll soldier on. What do you say?
Yeah, that's even the reason, Professor Chatterjee, why we're doing Bilateral View, because there's that specter that keeps on hunting us, to do this for the people, for the students, for other readers out there who value things like this. Because again, this is part of the intellectual life. And no one can really say that this ghost is never a thinker. This ghost is really intellectual, because again, we are pushed to do these things that don't really matter for some, but only matter to a few, just like you and I.
Well,
Why
on
not?
that, on that very, very optimistic note, Dr. Magan, I think we ought to inform our faithful audience that we have some extremely interesting episodes lined up for all of you. We have a bevy of, some of your heartthrob philosophers of the contemporary age, and some of the dangerous philosophers, as they are called. Uh, most of these people are still living. So we have to give you a preview. We have Marcus Aurelius, and then we have Slavoj Žižek, and we have Dr. Magan, your favorite, Jordan Peterson, and many people
Come
in
on.
between. So we have a whole list of people that we will be discussing on bilateral view. So it's for me to request you to canvas for our channel, Dr. Magan. Would you
Our
please?
dear viewers, once again, we're here to say that we have just given you something that you might ponder on in the next few hours, in the next few weeks or months. But for sure, you wouldn't be just content relishing hauntology for months, maybe for years. Why not do some comments if you'd like to engage with us? Like, subscribe if you think you want to ask for some of these ideas in the near future that would help you eventually realize some of these things you might want to do in the future as well. Like make yourself a vision to do the same. Discursivize as part of the 21st century intellectual life. Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magan. And it is time for me and for us to bid our viewers a warm goodbye. So I'm Arup K. Chatterjee signing off from India with a warm namaste to all of you.
Rhodora Magan again. I'm from Cebu, and I would say maayong gabi naton tanan. Daghan kaayong salamat sa pagpaminaw ug sa paguban ng karong gabi una. Thank you a million, Professor Chatterjee. Till next time, have a great night.